I also want to give a shout out to Mo because I saw it was her birthday. I don't know if she's still online. I know there's quite a few of y'all that have probably heard some version of this, maybe 3 or 4 times. I know Emily's come to my all-day workshop. I try to switch things around a little bit, a lot of the same content. But hopefully it's not too painful hearing me again. Everyone talks about it's like drinking water from a fire hose when I talk. So maybe the second or third time you catch more. Also want to give a shout out to the interpreter. I love that. That was the drinking fire out of fire hose. I'll apologize in advance. I'll try to speak slow, but I'm Argentinian and I don't do slow very well. And I start getting excited about this content. And I also only have 30 minutes. But I'll start off a little bit just to kind of introduce myself and kind of tell my story. Basically, for the last 20 years of my life, I have focused on how do we talk about tough issues, particularly what kind of processes can we develop to help us have the conversations that we need to have to come together across differences to be able to really deal with our shared problems well. My early work in grad school, getting my PhD, actually focused on national politics. My dissertation looked at how presidents from Johnson to Clinton talked about welfare and poverty issues. And I started getting really, really frustrated with national politics because it's just such a bad process, such a bad system. So when I got the job at CSU now 18, 19 years ago, I shifted my work from national to local, and I shifted from being more of a critic or a commentator on other people's communication to being much more of a practitioner, right? So I founded the CBD now 15, 16 years ago. It serves as this impartial resource to Northern Colorado. And I have said that phrase, we serve as an impartial resource to Northern Colorado, probably a few thousand times in the last 15 years. And I don't mean impartiality in a very simple way. I don't mean a detached neutrality. I don't mean a false equivalence, both sides. Everyone's truth is just as good as everyone else's truth, right? I won't be able to dig into all the kind of philosophy of this, but as Emily said, the ethic of the CPD is this notion of principled impartiality, that we believe that we need to be seen as impartial and develop a reputation of that to be able to have the impact we want to have on the community to help people have these tough conversations. But nonetheless, we have some pretty strong commitments to democracy, right? And strong commitments to good information and to kind of the pursuit of truth, some of the key values of universities. And we recognize the tension there that we're always going to be struggling with of honoring all 3 of those commitments at the same time, right? But I'm going to go ahead and pick up my slideshow here. And Emily, I gave Emily a link. I popped all my slides, a PDF online. I've got a lot of content here. Don't try to read all the content. This is a much larger kind of presentation that I'm just going to kind of give you a sense of it. One good news is I'm here at CSU. So if anything in the next 25 minutes kind of really sparks a lot of interest to you, I got my email right here on this slide and the last slide. And as Emily said, I'll be sticking around for the small groups so we can kind of dig in a little bit more there. And then the PFD, the PDF link, if you want to go back and kind of dig into some of the slides. So some of the slides I'll just touch on just to kind of give an overall kind of big picture of what I'm kind of trying to do today. And I'll also say that I very much have the perspective of I don't have it all figured out, right? The CPD is a constant experiment, constant process of trying to figure out better ways of coming together across perspectives. So I always welcome pushback, particularly from diverse audience coming from several different majors, several different life experiences. So I'm happy to kind of hear some pushback and see how you might fit these ideas and react to these ideas with your work. Right? Yeah, so quick kind of overview. What I'm going to try to do, we'll come back to the slide a few times. I'm going to try to answer 2 questions. One is, why are we so polarized and divided? Why is it so hard to have the tough conversations we need to have about some issues? And then I'll talk about, okay, how do we change the conversation? What do we do about that? How can we elevate our conversations in more productive ways? So the why are we so polarized? The quick answer to it is human nature is the first aspect. We're unfortunately much more wired for polarization and for outrage than we are for deliberation or collaboration, right? Our basic kind of how our brains are wired in important ways. Second, a big part of my work is so many of the ways that we try to engage each other not only don't work, but are often counterproductive. So a lot of my work now, I probably most define myself as a process designer. I design processes to help people come together across perspective. Unfortunately, most of the processes rely on, I would say 95% of the processes we rely on to help us deal with tough issues are not designed very well and tend to, unfortunately, bring out the worst in human nature rather than tap into the best of human nature. And in particularly, one of the worst is going to the national level. Our overly adversarial political system, which often dominates our conversations about lots of different issues, is one of the kind of worst offenders of some of those problems. Right. So the first half of this is pretty dark, pretty negative, right? But the good news is a lot of the work of the CPD, the hallmark of it, to keep my sanity and my mental health, is it's optimistic. There is a true belief that we can come together with good processes to deal with these issues. So I'll introduce some of the basics real quick on how to change the conversation, starting with some individual things. What can individuals do to kind of build your mindset and skill set? So the first, I'll introduce the Wicked Problems mindset of how do you think about issues differently? How do you look at issues differently to engage them? And then second, I'll talk briefly about building the individual skills for collaboration. But then I'll recognize also that just changing individually won't be enough, right? Being a collaborative individual in a highly adversarial partisan environment, you're going to get run over, right? So we all have to also commit to really working to build community capacity for better processes and engaging each other better. That's going to be really difficult at the national level, but at the local level, at the campus level, there's certainly things that we can do to start really changing the conversation, right? And then I'll close with a brief kind of note. Clearly a lot of leaders, particularly campus leaders on this call, you're also going to be the leaders in your communities kind of moving forward. So I'll make a kind of brief connection to the importance of what I call facilitative leadership and the leaders that we need in the 21st century to kind of address and build that capacity. So let's dive in. First, kind of talk a little bit about human nature. Some of the work, as a process designer about 5 years ago, I did this deep dive into social psychology and brain science just to really understand how are our brains wired, and again, why is it so difficult to have these tough conversations? Real quickly, these are some of the books I kind of dived into. I like some of these titles, the hidden forces that shape our decision. This one won a Nobel Prize. That our default is to think fast. We don't like to think. We're cognitive misers, right? We like to rely on heuristics or simple rules or assumptions, but we have the ability to think slow, right? So that question becomes process design. How do we switch from fast to slow when we need to engage an issue differently? Why you're not so smart, and 46 other ways you're deluding yourself. A lot of bad D words here. Why your brain distorts and deceives. My favorite title is What Makes Your Brain Happy and Why You Should Do the Opposite. Jonathan Haidt's work really kind of tries to dive into the moral foundations across kind of progressives and conservatives and helping people understand each other. This is a classic in the work of why we hold on to misinformation and how hard it is to get people to kind of push off that when it fits their narrative. This is a newer one I just started really diving into, trying to summarize a lot of the basic aspect of buy-side thinking, right? If this next 5-10 minutes are really interesting to you, I got about a 60-page report that really digs into all the nuance here. But for our purposes here, the quick little summary, 5 big themes that as I really kind of dug into that research that brought up some alarm bells for me from a process perspective as I try to bring people together. First is our brains are wired to crave certainty and consistency. Our brains are wired that once we make a decision, it defends that decision. It protects that decision. It seeks out more information to confirm that decision and push back against it, right? And second, we're suckers for the good versus evil narrative. This is one of those anthropological facts kind of across all cultures, across all times, that we think in terms of story. And the most powerful story is this archetypal story of the hero and the villain and the victim. And we like to see the world through that lens. And once we assign characters to those positions, again, we want to stay with those inconsistent. The picture here, I won't get into the details here, but lots of Disney villains, right? And I just realized as someone who's got 3 children and watched a lot of Disney movies, how often Disney is this basic kind of narrative in terms of good versus evil, and it's teaching us again and again to kind of try to define things from those simple perspectives. And then third, we're groupish. The popular culture, they use tribal and political tribalism and so forth. I think tribe is a much more complex term with a lot of positives and negatives. So I prefer Haidt's term in terms of groupish, which means we're not selfish, we're not individualistic. But as a species, we're certainly designed to be in groups. We're designed to be in teams. There's some good things about this that I'll tap into in a little bit, but there's also a lot of, unfortunately, negative out of this, right? Some of the worst things humans have ever done in history have been defining groups and defining an us and a them and dehumanizing the them and justifying horrible things. Part of the other good news is that us and them is kind of a social construction. Who's the us and who's the them? We have a lot of power over, right? I know the theme of today is shaping our reality, right? So how we think about that and how we adjust that in our communities becomes really important. But from a negative perspective, those three things combine and really work to influence how we think. My academic training is primarily in argumentation. Like, how do people make arguments? How do they back up their perspectives? What kind of sources and evidence and data and values? And but I also dig into use of emotions and stories and so forth. And unfortunately, one of the reasons it's so hard for us to have these tough conversations is these things all work together to really influence negatively how we think. Right? So I won't get into it in this presentation. Again, the longer piece, if you're interested in, but taking that last one of how it affects how we think, all these terms you see on the right, I imagine a lot of y'all are familiar with these. We're learning more and more about these things, but it's how our brains, again, are wired to, to protect our existing narrative. One way to think about this is our brains are really good at getting any new information to fit within our existing narrative, rather than allow new information to challenge that narrative. And that makes it harder and harder for us to have conversations across perspectives. And then last, our brain is really bad at dealing with dilemmas and tensions. And we'll come back to this in a little bit. You'll see how important that is. So that was a big part about human nature. So the second step is that makes it so hard for us to have tough conversation is bad processes that tend to not bring us together. Mm-hmm. And that's really one of the biggest issues that I deal with often, is that most of the processes that we deal with tend to fire up the worst part of human nature and rarely tap into or nurture the best in us in some important ways. Again, this is going to be really quick. I'm not going to be able to walk through all these steps, but a lot of the modeling that deliberative practitioners and conflict management people really kind of work on is, we have this basically a negative feedback loop, this cycle of polarization that makes it harder and harder for us to kind of deal with each other. So you start with those biases I just mentioned, that when people with opposing bias interact with each other, it normally makes things worse. The Russell effect is this recognition that some of the loudest voices are the most divided, and they tend to kind of dominate conversations sometimes. The internet, unfortunately, brings out the worst in us, makes it easy for us to gather like-minded people. The political system rewards bad behavior in so many situations and punishes good behavior. And the media, unfortunately, likes that narrative, right? They know that that's what's going to draw eyeballs and draw clicks and so forth. And these all kind of work together with each other and lead to this really negative situation in the middle, of where so many of our conversations are dictated from this adversarial perspective, right? Again, I won't walk through all those, but I'll really highlight the last one. Most important for all this is this takes up so much of our energy, so much of our creativity, so much of our time, that we have precious little to really work on those problems. And clearly we have tough issues that we need to deal with. So how do we kind of get out of this vicious cycle, right? The last thing I'll highlight, in particular, one of those aspects is the adversarial political system. This notion of idea, my focus is on process design, bringing people together. And then I look at our national political system with a two-party system, with winner-take-all elections, with so much money involved. From a process perspective, it's just, clearly tends to backfire, right? Tends to make it so difficult for us to deal with those issues. So a lot of my work is, again, switching from national to local to see what in a local community, how can we avoid a lot of these things and actually really build capacity to take on issues better. And then hopefully in the long run, as more and more individual communities figure out better ways of engage each other, we start kind of elevating things. Right? So that was all the bad news. I'll spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about the good news, right? Okay, how do we kind of change the conversation? And there is a lot of good news here, because we've seen more and more with good process. Certainly the history of the CPD in 15 years, with good process, we can bring people together, overcome a lot of those things, and work together to address shared problems. So the first kind of big individual thing that you can do is adopt what I call a wicked problems mindset. And I'll have 5 characteristics up here, but the overall idea And I look at wicked problems not as a category or a type of problem, but a way through which to see problem. It's a tool in your toolkit, right? So not 24/7, but having the ability to step back on an issue that you're struggling with and say, if I look at this as a wicked problem, how does that change the conversation? How does that might open up space to engage it in a different way? And I'll be honest here, I'm not saying there's not wicked people, right? Clearly they are. I'm saying two big things here that maybe we can dive in a little bit later in the smaller groups. One is our brains go to wicked people much faster, right? We like that fits the narrative. So there's lots of issues that we quickly kind of shortcut to assume it's wicked people, and that defines the issue, and that's obviously a problem. But even if the problem is caused by wicked people, there's a pragmatic value to framing things as wicked problem. One thing I know from the research above all is very few people self-identify as wicked. And if you tell someone you think they're wicked, they're much less likely, they're not necessarily likely to become less wicked, right? It elevates things and gets things kind of worse, right? And I can tell you for sure that the bad faith actors that we need to kind of address that have power, they love the fact that we're all just screaming at each other and facts don't matter, right? So as we start elevating conversations, as we start changing how we engage each other, as we put the wickedness in the problem rather than the people, we make it harder for those people we start taking away their power, I think, in more productive ways. Don't have too much time to really get into wicked problems. I'm just going to do the little 5-minute quick summary here. But this perspective is, again, a way of looking at problems where you're focusing on the underlying values and recognizing that all tough issues have lots of positive underlying values that don't fit together very well. And the easiest way, a lot of y'all have seen this slide, we've been working on water in Northern Colorado for about 12 years now, but I create these wicked problem slides as a first step to really understand the issue from this lens. And I actually created this from engaging broad conversations. The city will send me all the emails they got on an issue. I'll dig into all the comments on the Coloradan. We had 300 people show up to an initial meeting where we asked them, like, what's important to you on the river? What concerns that you have? And from all that noise, I kind of created these slides. And this shows the wicked problem in at least two ways. One is if you look at these boxes one at a time, they're all good things, right? Wicked problems framework is like, people that care about this issue, at least from their perspective, they care for good reasons, right? So there's not inherent negative values here. I'm not saying these values are all the same or all equal, right? Certainly the tough conversation we need to have is how do we prioritize these and which ones are more important. The second key aspect of wicked problem here is these things don't fit together very well. And unfortunately, the more we focus on one of these boxes or some of these boxes, it's harder to focus on the others. The conversation we need to be having in our communities is how do we negotiate the inherent tensions between these boxes? But unfortunately, our brains are not wired for that. Our brains want to pick one box at a time and frame things as if I'm for a good value, and anyone who disagrees with me is rejecting that value. That fits the narrative, that fits how our brains work, right? So long-term, what I try to develop is these three big conversations. The long-term conversation is this balancing. Okay, how do we find the right balance between this? How do we recalibrate things in some ways and prioritize and make this work better for most people and honor this, right? The short-term conversation, and this is where deliberative work really kind of overlaps with activism, is sometimes we need a pretty significant change. Maybe one value is dominating too much. Maybe one value has been left behind. Maybe a new value has been introduced that we need to consider, and we need a pretty significant shift. We need a significant change. Right? Long term, the ideal is kind of this transcending thing of we tap into human creativity, we tap into innovation and find ways of kind of creating win-wins, of overcoming kind of a traditional tension. But we rarely have these balancing, recalibrating or transcending conversations because those aren't natural, right? The dominant conversation, because of human nature, because of the processes we rely on, because of our overly adversarial political system, is we don't get those. So that is the importance of organizations and partial organizations' perspectives to come in and help us have these broader conversations, design things that work to, again, avoid triggering the worst of human nature and tap into the best. So real quick, these are just some other ones I worked on, but it's all the similar. They each, individually, these are all good things. They don't fit together very well. So how do we have that tough conversation? This is one we did out in Steamboat Springs about local food. Healthcare can be very complex, but in some ways we want those three things. They don't fit together very well. This is a process we ran about downtown Fort Collins for the city to think about all the different ways people want, downtown to kind of work for them. This is a process we did on parking a few years ago, which I thought it was more of a technical issue, but when we started getting surveys, we saw how value laden and how emotional people can be about parking. This is one of my favorites in a sense of really kind of showing how this works, right? So Fort Collins is a triple bottom line city. We care about those three things. We care about the economy, we care about the environment, and we care about people. This was actually initially developed by environmental activists that realized, the single bottom line is just profit, right? The focus of certain corporations. Well, they reframed it, and instead of demonizing profit, instead of staying adversarial like the economy against the environment, they said, you know what? What if we say, okay, profit or economic is a good thing, but how do we balance that better with people and the planet, right? And this is the best example of that transcendent option. If instead of seeing each other as adversaries, if we say, hey, we're working together to try to kind of find the right balance between all these things. Green jobs is clearly critical to CSU in Northern Colorado. And that's just a great example of transcendence. We're creating jobs that are good for the environment, that are good for the economy, and good for people. And we're switching from that adversarial to that collaborative that I'll highlight here. Lastly, here's the preamble of the Constitution. Embedded in that are some key values. If we kind of translate those into a little bit more modern terms, make the point that democracy itself is a wicked problem. Each of these one at a time are positive, right? And maybe I'm running out of time, but if people want to put on the chat, right? If you had to pick one of those values to be more important than the other four, right? Depending on how, we all define these differently, but for what it means to you. But I do this exercise quite often in my talks and in my class in a sense. And part of the recognition is this realization that in so many ways, we actually all have the same values. We just rank them differently, and we just deal with the tensions between them differently. And the problem again is our brains are wired to pick one of these at a time and to think I'm for this value and everyone disagrees with me against that. And that's what fuels that polarization and makes it difficult. But if we step back and we say, hey, all of these are good, but they don't fit together very well. There's some big natural tensions between these, right? Here are just some of those that we don't quite have time to dig into right now. But these are some big words that are they're often used to support different kind of conversations, but they're too often used as weapons to divide people or to mobilize your side. But when we reframe these value arguments, when we see them through a wicked problems lens, all of a sudden these value conversations can be tools to help us come together, tools to spark innovation, and tools to spark much more elevated conversations to deal with those issues. These are just some of the other ones. This goes back to that last point about how our brains are wired, that our brains hate dilemmas and tensions and paradoxes. Well, my argument here is the best thing we can do is retrain our brain to look for those tensions, to identify those tensions and put them on the table, because that's where the heart of the conversation is. And that's when we really start moving forward in dealing with our shared problems in much more productive ways. The best way to deal with wicked problems is we really have to talk across perspective. We need to tap into human creativity. We need to spark collaborative action. Those are not natural. Those are habits we have to build. Those are capacities that we have to create and sustain in our communities and in our organizations. So, wicked problems mindset. Start with the assumption, again, not saying there's not wicked people, but start with the assumption that the wickedness is in the problem versus the people. See how that changes the conversation. Be more comfortable with uncertainty. Understand how your brain works, right? And those points when you're so sure you're right and everyone else is wrong, a light should go off. Like maybe your brain's tricking you, right? Tap into that intellectual humility that's critical. Focusing on elevating the conversation, not just winning the argument. Make your impact in your conversation, not to try to win and show that you're right and they're wrong, but to try to help people have a better conversation, which can be critical. Put your energy towards identifying, I've already said that quite a few times, and overall work towards creating a learning community. We don't solve wicked problems. We never find the perfect way to arrange those values. What's critical is this ongoing conversation that helps us move forward in important ways. So how do we build capacity to have those ongoing conversations? I know I'm running out of time. These last ones are pretty quick. So in terms of individual skills, Don't have additional details here, but it's the recognition that skills that y'all, I know a lot of y'all are getting through their work in the LSC, listening skills, conflict management skills, dialogue skills, asking good questions. Asking good questions is one of the most important skills of problem solving and citizenship that we often, it's not inherently a part of our education processes sometimes, right? So we need to kind of build that up. Collaboration is this word that everyone loves, but it's hard. So how do we start training for that? How do you, particularly those of you who are students, how do you make sure as you're going through your major, you're getting exposed to a lot of the classes that are going to build those collaborative skills? Because that's going to be some of the most important skills, moving forward. And then lastly, building community capacity for better processes. I talked earlier about the problem is we trigger all the worst in human nature. Well, good process flips that around. It avoids triggering the worst and then actually taps into the good. And there's some good stuff to tap into, right? The positive side of the us versus them kind of groupishness is that we seek purpose and community. We have a lot of the same things that we want. Humans are naturally empathetic, and you can tap into that in kind of positive ways. We're naturally pragmatic and creative if we want to, right? That we can really kind of work on those issues. And while all those negative things are stronger and easier to kind of trigger, the more you do this, the easier it is to do, and you start building kind of the skill set, right? So we've seen that so much as you start kind of turn that vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle that builds this up. Right? So Emily, if you want to post that other link, can't get out obviously into the bells and whistles today. This is just one document, about a 20-page document online. It's getting dated. It's about 10 years old. We're working to update it, but just to give you a sense of the deliberative engagement, the tools that we use to really bring people together for lots of different purposes, as you see on the screen, to kind of engage. But what we recognize is the bottom line, the best way to bring people together across perspectives, to get people to have those aha moments, to shift, throwing facts at each other, attacking each other, those all backfire. Having a genuine conversation with someone that you've developed some trust in a relationship is what's going to have those shifts, and it's going to change people's minds. So how do we create more opportunities for those kind of conversations, right? So what I try to do is shift from the wicked people to wicked problems. That shifts us from adversarial mode to collaborative mode. That shifts from inciting the worst of human nature to bring out the best. And then from facts, facts don't work when we're adversarial. They don't matter. So even if the truth is on your side, it doesn't matter. When we're in collaborative mode, all of a sudden it does, right? So last slide, and setting it up, y'all are the leaders of today and the leaders of tomorrow. We need both traditional and facilitated leaders depending on the situation. But we rely too much on traditional leadership. That doesn't work with wicked problems, and it doesn't work in a polarized environment. So I really think the superpower of the 21st leaders is going to be the ability to bring people together across perspectives. So how do we build that? How do we have our leaders that are focused on making sure we have the individual mindsets and skill sets, but also that we build capacity in our communities to have the kind of conversations we need to have, right? So last slide, again, y'all can pull up the link earlier. I'm happy to continue the conversation, and I will be here in these small groups.